It's finally Friday, 3B, and it's time for tonight's story, A Dog's Porpoise. When we left the story yesterday, Natalie was wanting to jump into the water and save Lars, and her father was telling her it was not a good idea. You cannot go in that water. His tone was so urgent, so emotional, that even in this moment of crisis, Natalie was taken by surprise. "Oh, okay," she said, "but we have to find him." Her father nodded. "We'll do our best. Now, help me get these nets up and then we can look." In all the commotion, Natalie had totally forgotten about the two starboard nets that were still in the water. They jumped to it, pulling the remaining hauls in what Natalie thought had to be the fastest fish collection she'd ever seen in her life. Then her father started the boat back up and circled it around as slowly as possible. Natalie picked up both flashlights and stood on the deck, scanning every inch of the water. The whole time she yelled as hard as she could, until she barely had a voice, until they were almost back to shore, until she knew in her heart there was no way Lars would respond. By the time they'd returned to port, Natalie's face was soaked in stinging salt water, and she knew that it wasn't just because of the waves. A small wooden drawbridge spanned the entrance to the port. To enter or exit, someone had to hold down a big red button until the bridge went all the way up. It was supposed to be the harbor master's job, but he wasn't around tonight. He must have figured nobody would be crazy enough to go out in this weather. Normally, when the harbor master was off duty, Natalie loved hopping out of the boat to operate the drawbridge herself. Who wouldn't love a chance to hit an actual big red button? But now Mr. Prater eyed her nervously. "If you want," he began, "I can—" But Natalie was already headed for the edge of the boat. She figured she could use the distraction. She was careful not to slip on the rain-slicked dock, but as she ran up the wooden steps to the drawbridge control panel, she was surprised by how much things had cleared up by now compared to just a few minutes ago. The storm must have been calming down. By the time she got to the button, the rain had slowed to the slightest of drizzles, and she had a clearer view of her surroundings. All the boats in the harbor to one side and the sandy beach to the other. Just then she heard a strange sound emanating from somewhere within the surf, just before the whole bridge went up in a symphony of creaks and groans. Puff! What was that? As the drawbridge rose, Natalie's eyes scanned the shore, trying to find the source of the noise. She didn't see any people on the beach. All she saw was, "Natalie!" her father yelled a minute later as the Maria P. passed under the drawbridge and into port. "Natalie, you have to lower the bridge again." But Natalie was no longer at the button. She had already dashed down the staircase, shoes thunking on every wooden step, and then she was leaping from the boardwalk to the beach path, and then she was pounding across the wet sand, all thoughts of anything else totally forgotten. "Lars!" she yelled. "Lars, you made it!" "Woof! Woof!" There, bouncing happily on the beach, was Lars. He jumped up, putting his two front paws on Natalie's shoulder and licking her face, and Natalie wrapped him in a tight hug, squeezing him against the squishy surface of her life jacket. Lars looked like he'd just emerged from a laundry machine spin cycle, and he smelled like he really needed a laundry machine spin cycle. But to Natalie, he was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Don't you ever scare me like that again." She let Lars drop back down to all fours, where he panted happily up at her and then shook out his fur. From the looks of his matted coat, it was the 7th or 8th time he'd done it, and he still wasn't getting any less wet. "Natalie!" That was her father, panting as he ran up behind her. "I tied off as fast as I could. Nat, what's going on?" Natalie wasn't even sure how to answer. How could she explain this? She knelt down and scratched Lars right behind both of his ears, just the way he liked it. "How did you get back here?" she asked him, studying his face for a clue. How did you possibly survive? Lars just smiled at her and licked her nose again. As answers went, it was cute, but not very helpful. Puff! There was that noise again, coming from somewhere past the water line. As her father put his hands on his hips and stared down at Lars, Natalie slowly stood up and studied the surf. Puff! 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 If Natalie didn't know better, she'd say the sound was getting impatient with her. This time, her father heard it too, and he turned to look where Natalie was looking. What in the... he began, and then, oh, wow. There, gazing at them from just above the water, its dark gray back blending almost entirely into the cold April tide, was a dolphin! Natalie cried in amazement. No, her father said, just as amazed. Look at the rounded snout. It's a harbor porpoise. They're much shyer than dolphins. I've never seen one up this close for so long. As if grateful to finally be recognized, the porpoise rolled slightly to one side and then the other, his pectoral fins wiggling out of the water one at a time. He's waving, Natalie cried. Meanwhile, her father was looking slowly from the porpoise to Lars and then back to the porpoise again. I don't believe it, he said in a quiet voice. But Natalie was already 2 steps ahead of him, and she absolutely believed it. Did you rescue our dog? She asked the porpoise. Did you bring him back to shore? The porpoise puffed one more time and then squeaked out a chipper reply. Wee! Natalie wanted to say something back, but she was interrupted. Ruff! Lars barked. At the sound of the porpoise's voice, Lars had stood up and dashed, barking into the surf. They're talking. Natalie could barely keep up with all the amazing things that were happening. This had gone from the worst day of her life to the best so fast that she hadn't even had time to question it. And now, as the last of the rain cleared away and the moon began to poke out of the clouds, she realized just how late it was and how much she'd been through today, and just how very, very tired she had become all of a sudden. As if on cue, the porpoise squeaked one last time at Lars, gave one last roll wiggle of its fins, and then disappeared back into the water. The last thing they saw was its tail slapping against the surf, and then it was gone, like it had never been there at all, except for the dripping wet dog it had deposited on the side of the shore. Wait, Natalie yelled. I didn't even get to say thank you. But the sentence got quieter as she said it, her throat finally reminding her that it had been yelling in the rain for almost 30 straight minutes. Just as she began to feel faint, Natalie felt her father's arm wrap around her side, holding her up. If I see him when I'm out there, he said softly, I'll tell him thank you from all of us. Now come on, it's been a long day. Let's all go home. For once, Natalie was too tired to argue. She just let her father guide her back toward their shack, looking down at her feet, making sure one went in front of the other, even as Lars darted around her heels with as much energy as ever. As she stumbled through their front door and down the hall to her room, something registered in the fog of Natalie's tired mind. Mr. Prater had let Lars come back to the shack with them. And when she'd said our dog back on the beach, he hadn't corrected her. As she settled into her bed just a few minutes later, Natalie came to a decision. She had to find that porpoise again, because in the days to come, she felt she would have a lot to thank him for. Then Natalie closed her eyes and the whole world went dark. Chapter 6. Lars. The whole world was dark, but luckily dogs had excellent night vision. Lars padded through the Prater household as quietly as he could, trying to find a good place to sleep. He would have loved nothing more than to curl up in bed with Natalie, but he knew there were a few reasons that he shouldn't even try that. First of all, he was already pushing his luck with Mr. Prater by being in the house at all. Just because his overboard adventure had given everyone a scare didn't mean he could suddenly act like royalty. Second, he smelled like a clump of washed up seaweed with fur, and he knew it. Humans always thought dogs didn't know how bad they smelled when they were wet, but the exact opposite was true. Humans only had human noses to work with. They couldn't smell the half of it. And finally, Lars always had trouble sleeping near people, even on the best of nights. He was a very active dreamer, and he'd been woken up lots of times by people complaining that he was softly kicking or barking in his dreams again, chasing squirrels or trying to communicate with very large tennis balls that had somehow learned to talk. Sometimes he got so loud that he woke himself up. So he set out on his own to find a nice secluded sleeping spot, and after a few minutes he found one. A corner of the living room with its very own heating vent, the perfect place for a waterlogged dog to curl up and dry off in his dreams. Before he lay down, he did his traditional 3 turns around his sleeping territory, acclimating to the soft carpet and the gentle hum of the heating vent. But on his 3rd rotation, something strange happened. The humming from the heating vent was replaced by another sound, one he'd never heard come out of a vent before. It was a distant gurgling. It was almost as if it sounded like there was water bubbling in the walls of the house, somewhere in the distant corners of the ventilation shaft. Lars didn't know much about human houses as your typical domestic dog, but he knew that there definitely wasn't supposed to be any water back there. Still, the gurgling was getting louder, now almost a full-on rushing sound. A low growl started in the back of Lars' throat, and his ears pointed stiffly backward as the hair rose all along his back. There was something very wrong inside this heating vent, and it was getting closer by the second. Suddenly, water flooded out of the vent like a gush from a hose, and even though the vent had been warm just a minute ago, the water that was filling up the living room was ice cold, and it didn't have the fresh taste of human tap water either. It was salty and brackish, just like the seawater, the water Lars had almost drowned in this evening. The water was everywhere now, and deep, so deep that Lars couldn't touch the ground. The coffee tables and couches floated past him, crashing into one another, adding an extra threat to the situation. Lars whimpered and barked, not even caring if some of the water went down his throat. He had to warn the Praters. He had to make sure what had happened to him didn't happen again, and certainly not to anyone else. He had to make it to land. But there was no land, only water and waves and loud crashing sounds and the return of the hopelessness he'd felt just hours ago. And then, fins and a flash of gray. Then Lars was riding high again, perched on top of his porpoise friend, no longer afraid of anything. They did a loop around the living room furniture, and then they were off, leaping over the waves, gleefully squeaking and barking back and forth. And Natalie was there too, and Mr. Prater, and everyone was safe and happier. But no one was happier than Lars, because he knew that all of these people, and this porpoise, were his friends. Lars had met a lot of nice people in his life, people who he had always had to move on from, or who had moved on from him. But for the first time in his long and lonely life, this stray dog had finally found some nice people who would come back for him and who would lift him up when he was down. He had real friends, and he was happy. Then he woke up. Oh, right, of course. It had all been a dream. There had never been a scary flooded heating vent. He had never tried to sleep by a heating vent at all. He had curled up outside Natalie's door, as close to her as he could reasonably get without stinking up her room. and within seconds he'd fallen asleep and launched into one of his crazy dreams. It was a typical Lars dream, the scary kind that involved worrying and growling and things he couldn't control. But it also wasn't the typical Lars dream, because even though he was awake now, he could still remember how amazing the end of the dream had been. It had a happy ending, and it wasn't just something Lars had dreamed up. That feeling, that friendship was real, and all of these friends were close to him now, sleeping peacefully. Well, not all of them. Lars closed his eyes and sniffed the air, flaring his ears out for good measure. His super-sensitive hearing could easily make out the bird song beyond the walls of the Prater household. It was already morning, and Lars had dreamed the whole night away. But if he focused even harder, cast his hearing even farther, smelled the air the way only a dog could, there was the rolling of the waves on the beach outside, soothing and gentle compared to last night's frenzied crashing. And somewhere in those waves, maybe he was imagining it, but it didn't sound like something was splashing and puffing. There was only one way to find out. As Lars rose to his feet, he was gripped with an absolute certainty that he would find out. After all, friends came back for other friends, and he had a friend to find. And that is it for tonight. On Monday, we will begin Chapter 7, Natalie. Have a great Friday evening and a wonderful weekend, and I will see you on Monday. Good night.